everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to share with you a slightly different kind of video than what I usually do. A lot of my project videos are kind of diaries almost, like showing you the entire journey through all of the craziness trying to make a plan work into a final thing. But today I wanted to kind of focus more on the theory. It's not really a tutorial, sort of I guess, but it's more me sharing you the theory behind the steps I take. Because I know often in the videos of projects it can get a little bit confusing as to like what my plan is and what I'm trying to do, because I'm so focused on like sharing what I do each day. But in this video, since this is kind of a two-parter, I wanted to share with you how I get from an idea or a reference image to a final Tunisian crocheted garment. Now, preface this by saying I am not an expert by any means. I have never had any formal education on how to create Tunisian crochet patterns, and in fact, this sweater was technically my first Tunisian crochet project. So I have kind of made up all of this. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. If you know of better ways to do this, please go ahead and do them. I still struggle reading Tunisian crochet patterns because my method is so different from others, but I thought that I would share with you the theory behind my process. So what am I going to do to go from this to a finished project that there's currently just a question mark here for, because I haven't quite finished this one yet. Let's get started. Okay, so in this video I'm going to be referencing two projects, specifically the autumn sweater, which is the first video on my channel that you might like to go back and see if you are interested. It was the first big Tunisian crochet project I've ever done, and definitely the first crochet pattern I had ever made from scratch. I learned a ton in this process, and it hugely helped me making the next very large project. I lied. I'm actually going to be referencing a couple of other projects in here as well that don't have videos because they're not technically done yet. One of them is the Starry Night scarf that's right here. This is by far the most detailed Tunisian crochet project I have ever seen or attempted to do, certainly. It has a huge amount of detail. It's really pretty, but it's only about this long so far. But I learned a lot about doing sharp turns and how various stitches looked. So this one was very important for that. Another project that I did recently was the Maggie's Mountains hat over here, which I have also made only one of, even though I've kind of played around with it a little bit. I tried to like remake the pattern a little bit. It's kind of complicated, and since it's Tunisian knit, it's very thick and warm, but it's a pretty complicated project, so I also haven't quite finished this one to the point where I would like to make a video about it. But if you are interested in me making a video about either of these projects, let me know in the comments down below and I'll see what I can do. I'm not promising anything though. They're kind of intimidating. But the other main project that this video is technically a part of, it's kind of the part one, is the sunflower sweater. Okay, so once you have the initial idea, the first thing to do is to draw it, basically. Even if you're not super good at drawing, you need to at least have a basic silhouette and idea of what you're trying to do. Now, if you hadn't noticed, I tend to like sunflowers on blue backgrounds. And the other major inspiration for this project was a Edwardian bicycling sweater. If you look them up on Pinterest or something like that, you will see that they kind of have this shape. They are very fitted in the bodice, and then they have these gigantic sleeves that go just past the elbow, and then a very long, tight cuff. And I wanted to do something that had this beautiful Edwardian historical feel, but also had like a modern twist. If you don't notice, that's kind of how I roll around here. And I wanted to have this really big dramatic image of a sunflower, and it's only like a quarter of a sunflower across the front, and it connects over to the back. The next thing to do after that, so step number 2, is for me to find the materials. Because if you don't have the materials to do a project, it's not really worth going any further. So I ended up getting a collection of gorgeous yarns from Bad Sheep Yarn. This is not sponsored, but go check them out. They are incredible. And I had this blue, which I do not have the name for, unfortunately. I lost it at some point. And then I had this yellow, which is called Talisman. It is an incredible mix of golden yellows with a little bit of orange and a little bit of brown. It's just absolutely beautiful. And then I also had this reddish brown color, which is called Olive Tapenade? Something like that. I don't know how to pronounce this name, but it's right here. There's the name. If you know how to pronounce it, let me know. So with these three initial colors, I knew that I had at least a general color scheme and materials to go forward. I ended up getting 4 of these blues because they were a very unique color. I actually was so obsessed with finding the right blue that I even went to Home Depot to find it. This is how picky I am about this particular blue. I'm at Home Depot looking at all the paint chips to find this color. So it's definitely not on this side, because that's all green. It's definitely not like here over. What's the word I've been using? I think it's a little too purple. Cornflower is pretty close. For me, I find materials super inspiring, especially colors of yarns and things like that. So before I can really envision how I would make this into a final item, I really want to have those materials on hand to kind of play with it and see how they work together, see if this idea has any merit at all and if I should move forward. The next thing that I like to do, so step number 3, is to find and or make a fabric pattern that will give the basic place of where to start. So in this particular case, I referenced the Voice of Fashion book again. Originally, I planned this floral blouse to basically be the mock-up for this sunflower sweater, but it ended up being a huge pain and also very blousy. But it gave me a great place to start because now I knew, after playing with that pattern a little bit, that if I could get something kind of similar, it would fit me decently. So I went through the Voice of Fashion book and I found this bodice pattern and this back pattern, both of which are used multiple times throughout the book. So number 1, getting to know this pattern is probably a good idea. That way I have a place to start for a lot of the other patterns in the book. And also because it's used a lot, it should be pretty basic. For the sleeves, I decided to use the pattern for the sleeves that I used for this blouse project, which were not the ones included with that pattern. They were included elsewhere in the book, but they're the same sleeves basically. They ended up being too short for that project, but for this one they would be perfect because I wanted it just past the elbow with a really long cuff. The next thing to do once you have a basic paper pattern is to figure out how your stitches are actually going to fill this space. Now with Tunisian crochet, it's actually fairly easy to apply stitches to a flat pattern piece because they are almost perfectly square depending on your tension and everything else. But the Tunisian simple stitch, I have found through doing this several times, that you can pretty much count on it being almost perfectly square. So you can pretty much fill these up however you want as long as your stitches are mostly square-ish. So you can see from here, there are a ton of different things that I did to make this fill in nicely with a bunch of square stitches. Before you get too far into that, you really have to think about what kind of stitches you want for your project. And for something like that, I highly recommend getting a book, something similar to this, or the Reader's Digest needlework book, or a bunch of other stitch dictionaries, stitch bibles, stitch lists, like anything that just gives you a bunch of ideas of what your stitches are going to look like. So for me, I wanted to have the main body of the sweater be just the Tunisian simple stitch because it's square and it's very easy to do and it's very fast as well. And it looks really nice. So doing that for the basic body of the sweater worked quite nicely. The center was a little harder to figure out, and I think I've actually changed my mind a little bit during this process. Initially, I had done, I think, what's called the twisted stitch, but I think this next time I make it, I'm going to use honeycomb, which kind of looks like this. Now, the hardest thing by far was figuring out what kind of stitch I should do for the flowers. And part of the problem for that is just, it's hard to find a stitch type that has a very strong horizontal feel to it. A lot of Tunisian crochet stitches are very vertical, or they're kind of tweed-like, where they're kind of woven. You have a lot of colors intermixing, which works well for a lot of projects, but for this one specifically, I wanted to have that feel of how wrinkly and vertically striped sunflower petals often are. Just because of the shape of them, you get a lot of texture in that. And since I'm using a yarn that has a lot of variation in the colors, I wanted to have something that would have a strong horizontal texture as well as look with the final stitch colors. Now before, when I had done Starry Night, I had used the purl stitch, which was pretty easy to do. The problem is twofold. Number one, once you have the purl stitch next to something else, you can end up with some vertical stripes. It looks a lot like Tunisian simple stitch, which I did not want to have. And the other problem was, because of the way you're doing it, you have two tight rows of little loops kind of going like this across. But the problem is that one of the rows is from the previous stitches that you're pulling up. So it would be one color, and then this loop would be a different color. So you have variation along this row and variation along this row, but it looked very mixed and it was not defined enough to really make it work. So it took me a little while, but I did end up finding what I believe is called the reverse stitch. Right, yeah, reverse stitch, which looks kind of similar to the purl, but it is basically just pulling up the back of the stitch. So you have like all of the previous stitch being visible, which means you have a much wider band of color that's having its gradient going along. So that worked almost perfectly. And it's quite easy to do as well, which is nice. So once I had a basic idea of what stitches I wanted to use, and I had a rough estimate of how I wanted it to look, it wasn't really a mock-up, it was a this could work maybe, but I'm not too attached to it and I can undo it if I need to. So you can call that a mock-up and a half, I guess, maybe? You could call it that? Where am I? I've stopped counting my steps. Okay, so number 1, draw. Number 2, materials. Number 3, pattern. Number 4, figure out your stitches. Number 5, give it a shot. See what you're doing. You can either use other yarns that you don't really care about as much to kind of make a mock-up. With the autumn sweater, I did kind of a double size version of it where I was using 2 strands of DK-ish acrylic yarn, and it was huge, so it was actually pretty fast to throw together, but it was very different from what the end product would be. But it did let me know that I was making the pattern correctly, and the finished product actually matched the pattern, which is extremely important to know. That was kind of how I figured out that I was right. The Tunisian simple stitch is a square. And to be able to try it on, see how the fit is, see how the stitches stretch and drape. So doing some kind of a mock-up, whether it's double-sized or whether you're doing it with different yarn, whether you're doing it with the same yarn at your actual size and you think you might have it ready, so you kind of go forward. Whatever it is, you need to have some kind of practice making the stitches and the directions. So that part of the process is usually very intermixed between adding stitches to the pattern and actually making the stuff, because it's a learning experience of, okay, is the way I'm applying these stitches making sense? Does the pattern actually fit the final product? All that sort of stuff. So in the initial autumn sweater project, I had to put down every single one of those stitches by hand with a ruler, because that was like the only way I could figure out how to do it. Once I got into the Starry Night, I started thinking, okay, maybe I could have 5mm wide washi tape to help me lay down where the rows are at least, and that sort of worked, except washi tape does not have a very strong sticking power, so it very quickly would start pulling up. And a lot of them are a little bit glossy, so if I write on it with a pen, it doesn't sink in at all and it rubs off very easily, which is extremely frustrating. But then, eventually, I finally had the idea to use sticker paper and print out grids, because not only would that save me the time of laying down each grid individually, it would also be a little more precise, having the grid stitches printed out already, and if I got the right kind of sticker paper, I could also write on it fairly easily, which is where this stuff comes in. Now, it's covered in cellophane, so it's going to be very noisy, so I'm going to not move it around too much. But I am going to link this down below because it's been such an incredible resource, and I'm not sure how many things out there are exactly like this. This sticker paper, this is one of the grids that I had printed. It has a very paper-like consistency to it on the front, which means I can write on it, and it's just like writing on printer paper. It just works perfectly. It has very little bleeding, and I can print out whatever I need to and then write on top of it with pencil or pen, and it works great. So now I can print out grid paper to whatever size I need. In the autumn sweater project, every stitch was about 5mm by 5mm. Very, very, very small. In this one, it's about 1/4 inch, which is a little bit bigger. And then I can just cut out single strips or larger sections if I need to, and lay it down on the pattern in whatever shape I need to, and that makes it so much easier to lay down like complicated curves and things like that. Once I have the stitch grids laid out, I have to write down what the actual steps are that I need to take while I am actually doing the thing. Now, let me tell you, this part of the process is very complicated and very long. I have used up so much of this book with the autumn sweater project. Let's see, where does it start? Right here. That's about how much paper it took me to write down most of the autumn sweater project. Now, I had pretty much never used Tunisian Crochet Patterns, so while I was making the autumn sweater project, I kind of made up the way that I can write directions, because I wasn't doing a lot of complicated stitches. It was more just where are the increases, where are the decreases, and where do I need to slip. Another big thing for me is with Tunisian crochet, you end up with a hook full of loops, right? And with the autumn sweater project, I could have hundreds of loops on my hook, and I also need to be able to make new lines and come back and yada yada. So I focused all of my direction writing on being able to count the number of loops on the hook to tell me where I am and what I need to do next. So often in actual Tunisian crochet directions, it'll say do 4 of this stitch and then 1 of these and then 4 of those and then 1 of these and then 17 of this and then so on and so forth. But since I wasn't changing stitches, I was only changing colors, I could just always assume that if nothing was written, I'm just supposed to do a bunch of simple stitches or whatever I'm doing in that particular section. And then I would say skip 10, for example, if I wanted to skip over a stitch, and then I could say D11, 12 if I wanted to put 2 stitches into 1 stitch. So it was always based off of how many loops I had on the hook at once, which made it so much easier. That's pretty much all I can really say about writing directions, because again, it is kind of a complicated process that doesn't really fit any other Tunisian crochet projects or like other crochet patterns. So I've kind of broken my own brain because now I find it very hard to follow like Tunisian crochet directions in a book, which is probably not great. But with the type of projects that I'm doing where it's more about the curve of the rows than it is the different types of stitches, it works pretty well for me. Part of the reason why I kind of do a little bit of each while I am working on the project, I am also writing the pattern. Part of that is because I want to make sure that I'm not messing anything up, that my process actually makes sense, and also because I might want to remember a little bit about what's going on in a row if it gets too complicated. So I often do a little bit of each, so I will get to a specific spot in the pattern making and then I will catch up to my written down directions and then I'll go back and forth. So yeah, in theory, that's pretty much it. So yeah, you start with a concept, draw a picture, then I like to find my materials. Next, I make a pattern that would work well for fabric. Make sure you take out the seam allowances. I forgot to say that earlier. If you have a pattern that has seam allowances in it, you want to make sure that you've gotten rid of those before you move any further, because it will not fit if you include the seam allowances. So, and then you take your grid sticky paper and lay out all of the rows and the stitches. Next, you go through each of those rows and count out where you have skips and doubles and anything else you might need to know, like where you have to switch colors, things like that. And then you make it. That's kind of all there is to it, really. But anyways, that is pretty much my process for taking an idea and turning it into a Tunisian crochet project. So I better get back to work because this sunflower sweater project is not going to make itself. As of the taping of this, I had gotten, I don't know, about that far. And I realized that number one, I wanted to add more colors to the petals and the center. And number two, I didn't quite like the fit. I wanted to change a little bit here and there. It was really close to being good and I could have just gone forward with it, but I really wanted to be perfect-ish. So I frogged the whole thing and now I have to start from scratch, which is great because I always got to do things the hard way. So let me know if you ever do a project with kind of the same step. And before I let you go, let me explain why I can't really sell the patterns to these. The main reason is the sizing is going to be different for everybody and you want it to fit. With the autumn sweater project, that's probably one of the most simple projects that I will ever do, honestly. But even with that, you had lines coming in from the skirt and then going up and over the shoulders and then around and back and down to the skirt. And those kind of curves, they're going to have to be extremely different for any size other than this one. There's the one size, but also like what am I going to give you as the pattern? Because I have these. I can give you these, but they don't really for anyone else. I think even me, if I received something like this, I wouldn't really know what to do with it. I could give you my pages of scribbles of like, you know, doubles and skips, but even those probably won't make much sense to anyone unless you're me. This is definitely not the way that Tunisian crochet patterns are usually written, but it just works for my method. So I don't really know how I would make these into sellable patterns because it will take dozens of hours to adjust a pattern for a new size, and the directions are going to be completely different. It's not like a normal sweater pattern where it's basically straight up and down and you can just get rid of a few stitches on the side or, you know, make it shorter or anything like that. You really can't adjust it in that way because of the way that the rows curve so much. So yeah, I don't quite know how I would make these patterns sellable unless I had some incredibly clever computer program that could do it for me. I don't know. So yeah, that's why they're not sellable. However, I am willing to do commissions. Now I will admit that my price for commissions is not cheap at all. And one of these projects takes me multiple months. But if you are interested, if you have a design idea but you don't know how to go forward with it, or you would like me to make something for you, go ahead and go to this link. I am very willing to work with you and find a way we can make this happen. Again though, it is not going to be cheap just because of the number of hours it takes me to do this. I mean, this one part, which honestly is basically the mock-up for the final version because the final version is shaped differently, this one piece took me multiple days to do because not only do you have to lay out all of the lines in a way that, you know, keeps the squareness as square as possible, but then you have to go through and count every single stitch and write it down. So it's not an easy process and it takes a very long time to do. So thank you for watching the video thus far. I hope that this video helped explain a little bit about how I make these projects, why the patterns aren't going to be made available just for sale, and why one of these projects takes me so very long. So anyways, thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for the video about the sunflower sweaters itself. That one is going to be more like my other videos, where it's kind of a video diary showing you the process. It ended up being quite a complicated and lengthy process, and I'm not even done with it yet. So I think that will probably be August or September. So yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you so much for watching, and have an amazing rest of your day.